The grand ballroom at Somerton Hall smelled of melting beeswax and expensive floor wax. The suffocating weight of heavy floral perfumes mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of pure social judgment. Clara Penhaligon stood near the periphery of the candlelight, clasping her hands tightly together to hide the thickened calluses earned from long nights spent mending the very sarsenet gown she wore. The delicate seams strained under the tension, screaming with the effort of holding together under her meticulous, desperate needlework. It was a particular kind of torture to be a ghost trapped inside a fading silk cage. In this glittering room, the Penhaligon name carried the heavy gravity of penury rather than the protective weight of gold. Yet she was forced to maintain the hollow pretense of her aristocratic class. She was expected to provide a drab backdrop for the vibrant lives of others as the foundation of her own legacy eroded into dust. Lady Honoria Vance approached, with the predatory grace of a woman who knew the exact mathematical damage a single sentence could inflict. Draped in deep emerald silk that caught the candlelight in a way Clara's mended dress never could, her intricate jewelry clinked with the cold, measured sound of a ticking clock. Honoria stopped just short of Clara's personal space. Her sharp gaze raked over the faded bodice of the old sarsenet with mocking efficiency. She dissected Clara in a public square without ever needing to raise her voice. The silence between them stretched out, thick and stagnant. Finally, Honoria spoke, her voice carrying a polished edge designed to cut much deeper than a physical blade. She remarked, speaking loud enough for the surrounding aristocratic guest to hear, that it was truly remarkable how some bankrupt family managed to preserve their ancient heirlooms. She added, with a calibrated sigh, that perhaps the dead dust of a ruined library was a better preservative than the lively air of a ballroom. The calculated insult was a jagged piece of glass wrapped in elegant velvet. Clara felt a fierce heat rise in her throat, a dry, stinging burn that had nothing to do with the warmth of the crowded room. She watched Honoria move away gracefully. The emerald silk swished like a dangerous snake sliding through dry summer grass. For the first time in her 24 years, the desire to remain invisible died inside Clara's chest. She had spent a lifetime learning the precise shape of being unseen. She knew the exact temperature of silence and how it could chill a human heart to winter ice. This evening she could no longer bear the freezing cold of their collective disdain. Her gaze drifted toward the glass walls of the conservatory, where the shadows were deeper and the air free of the cloying scent of expensive mockery. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her away from the polished faces and the suffocating glare of the chandeliers. Standing in a dimly lit corner of the plant-filled room, she found a forgotten bottle of spiced ratafia, abandoned among the heavy ferns. The crystal bottle felt solid and real in her hand. As she poured a generous measure of the potent, sweet cherry liqueur into a discarded glass, she felt the very first stirrings of a reckless, unfamiliar fire. The ratafia was intensely sweet upon her tongue. It carried a subterranean heat that dissolved the constructed walls around her battered pride. Finishing a second glass, the imposing world of Somerton Hall began to lose its sharp, judgmental clarity. The paralyzing fear that usually anchored her safely to the shadows was replaced by a sharp, rising sense of irony. She looked down at her mended sarsenet gown and saw the undeniable work of her own capable hands. The concrete evidence of a competence these pampered people could never hope to understand. She felt a fierce urge to speak the truth out loud. She wanted to shatter the stifling social protocol that required her to smile, as her soul was picked apart for sport. She was weary of being the invisible girl, tired of fading into the background of a world she used to own. She had spent far too long accounting for every slight and unpaid debt in the physical pages of the ledger of slights. That heavy, leather-bound notebook waited securely in her writing desk, its precise ink tallying the true cost of her ruined heritage. When she stepped back into the bright ballroom, her heart beat with the steady thud of a rhythmic drum in a quiet house. Alistair Thorne, the formidable Duke of Ravenwood, stood alone near the massive marble fireplace. He was a daunting silhouette of granite and shadow that seemed to naturally repel the frantic energy of the room. He was the scarred recluse of their county. He was a man whose silences were legendary and whose searching gaze had sent more than one ambitious debutante scurrying for cover. There was a profound stillness about him that Clara admired. His immense power was expressed cleanly in the economy of his movements. He was a man accustomed to the weight of heavy estate ledgers and the damp stone of Ravenwood Abbey. This evening, His solid presence was the only thing in the entire room that did not feel like an elaborate lie. Though her vision was slightly hazy with the liqueur, her internal purpose remained crystalline. She realized she was no longer afraid of the Duke's notorious silence. The ratafia had unexpectedly handed her the heavy iron keys to a kingdom of high-stakes honesty. She was resolute, determined to use them before the harsh morning light returned her to a life of quiet desperation. The glittering crowd parted as she moved deliberately toward him. A rising ripple of surprised whispers and rustling silk followed in her wake. She could feel the sharp gaze of Lady Honoria Vance burning on the back of her neck, a prickle of malice that only fueled her newfound resolve. Coming to a halt directly before Alistair Thorne, she realized she was smiling. It was not the polite, fragile smile of a broken Penhaligon, but something sharper, almost dangerously feral. The Duke did not move away. His intense gaze shifted smoothly to her flushed face. His eyes were dark, fathomless, and inscrutable. He did not ask her what she wanted, nor did he offer empty pleasantries. He simply waited in the quiet space between them, his stillness acting as a profound challenge. Clara took a deep breath, letting the sweet scent of the ratafia and the acrid smoke of the tallow candles swirl in her dizzy head. She felt the heavy words finally bubble up from the depths of her long-suppressed grief. She knew this was a foolish joke, a desperate act of theatrical rebellion meant to humiliate the arrogant woman who had just mocked her. Yet, in the blazing heat of this moment, it felt like the only pure truth she had ever dared to utter. "Your Grace," she began, her voice carrying with an unexpected bell-like clarity that cut through the ballroom chatter. "Since it appears that I am destined to be invisible regardless of my present company, and since you seem to find the people in this room just as tedious as I do, I have a sudden proposal for you." She saw the Duke's left eyebrow twitch upward, the only visible sign of his interest. The sheer, dizzying momentum of her recklessness carried her forward. "Marry me," she stated, her breathless laughter dancing lightly on the edges of the impossible words. "Marry me as a grand joke, Alistair Thorne. Do it just to save me from the crushing boredom of being entirely unseen. We could easily give these terrible people something to talk about, besides the tragic age of my mother's mended gowns. It would be a rather magnificent irony, would it not? The ruined, bankrupt daughter and the famously silent Duke, bound legally together by nothing but a shared disdain for this ballroom." She refused to look at the surrounding crowd. However, she could physically feel the heavy silence descending upon them all. Every guest froze in place. Their expensive silk fans were arrested in mid-air. The resulting silence possessed a crushing physical weight. It felt like a thick, suffocating wool blanket pressing down on her chest. Clara sharply felt the first cold prickle of rational realization seeping through the fading warmth of the cherry liqueur. The sheer enormity of what she had done started to settle deep in her stomach like a lead stone. She had brazenly insulted a powerful duke in public, making a mockery of their strict social contracts in front of the very people who would ensure she never found a safe place in society again. She stood frozen, waiting for the inevitable explosion. She braced herself for the Duke's righteous anger or his cutting dismissal. She stared blindly at the dark cravat at his strong throat, desperately noting the precise fold of the expensive linen and the steady rise of his chest. The stillness in that long moment was utterly frigid. A biting social frost threatened to shatter the foundational stones of her remaining dignity. Then Alistair Thorne moved. He did not step back in disgust or seek the protective help of his host. Instead, he took a single, deliberate step closer to Clara. His massive presence loomed over her like a sheltering stone mountain. He reached out slowly. His large hand was surprisingly warm and firm as it cupped her fragile elbow. It was a gesture that was neither aggressive nor dismissive. It felt miraculously protective. He leaned in smoothly, bringing his striking face so close that she could instantly smell the comforting scent of cedar wood and old library leather that clung naturally to his clothes. The heavy gold of the Ravenwood signet ring upon his finger caught the candlelight. His dark gaze locked intently onto hers, with a sudden ferocity that made her breath catch painfully in her throat. The ballroom was so still she could hear the faint hiss of a single wax candle burning dangerously low. Alistair's stern lips subtly thinned into what might have easily been a true smile in another, kinder life. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to directly vibrate in the very marrow of her teeth. He whispered a single solitary word. It was a sound that held all the immense weight of a royal legal decree and the finality of a closing iron door. "Done." The heavy word hung suspended in the still air long after he had finished speaking. It was a dangerous spark dropped carelessly into a room full of dry gunpowder. Clara felt the Duke's warm fingers tighten on her arm, a silent, commanding instruction to hold her ground with dignity, as the judgmental world around them disintegrated into chaos. Looking slightly past his broad shoulder, she saw Lady Honoria Vance. The matriarch's pristine face had gone a peculiar, sickly ashen shade of pale grey. Her painted mouth hung open. The shock radiating throughout the room was palpable, a collective, gasping intake of breath sounding like a fierce wind ripping through dead autumn leaves. The drunken joke had ceased to be a joke the very second that binding word left the Duke's lips. As Clara stood there with him, her frantic heart hammering wildly against her ribs, she realized a profound truth. Her invisibility had finally evaporated. She was now the undeniable center of the universe, the vital pivot point upon which the entire strict social hierarchy of Somerton had just tilted. The strong man holding her arm was not a predatory hawk, but a solid, impenetrable fortress built of stone and honor. The hazy effect of the ratafia was gone, replaced by the terrifying crystalline reality of a permanent vow. It had been sealed quietly in the shadows, validated by the heavy Ravenwood signet, and witnessed by the very people she had desperately sought to defy. I would love to know where you are tuning in from tonight, and have you ever felt the profound peace of being truly seen by someone? Share your safe sanctuary with me in the quiet space below. The grey, watery light of a typical British morning filtered through thin, moth-eaten curtains, illuminating thick dust motes that danced in the stagnant air of Clara Penhaligon's bedchamber. Clara woke to a silence that was not peaceful. It was the hollow, ringing quiet of a bell that had been struck too hard and was now vibrating with a dull, persistent aftershock. Her head throbbed with a rhythmic heat, the lingering metallic price of the spiced ratafia she had consumed with such reckless abandon. The taste of copper and fermented cherries sat heavy on her tongue, a physical residue of the desperation that had seized her soul at Somerton Hall. She lay perfectly still, staring at the cracks in the plaster ceiling, waiting for the memory of the ballroom to dissolve like a fever dream. But the memory remained stubbornly sharp, etched in her mind with the precision of an engraver's tool. She could still feel the surprising warmth of the Duke's hand on her elbow and the low, resonant vibration of his voice in the very marrow of her bones. Done. The word was a heavy stone dropped into the quiet, stagnant pond of her life, and she was currently drowning in the ripples. Beside her, tucked beneath the edge of the thin mattress, lay the Ledger of Sleights. It was a modest, leather-bound book, its edges softened by years of secret handling. In its pages, Clara had meticulously recorded every debt of dignity she had been forced to pay. The sneers from Lady Honoria regarding her mended lace, the cold dismissals from the local gentry, and the precise cost of remaining invisible. She reached out, her calloused fingers, ruined by the nightly labor of textile restoration, tracing the spine of the book. It was her only anchor in a world that sought to wash her away. Today, however, the ledger felt like a record of a different kind. It was no longer a tally of what she had lost, but a testament to the reckless gamble she had made. The ratafia had not just emboldened her, it had burned away the carefully constructed mask of the impoverished gentlewoman, leaving behind something raw and terrifyingly visible. Mary Wickham entered the room without the courtesy of a knock, her footsteps muffled by the worn, uneven floorboards. She carried a tray of cold tea and a single slice of dry, slightly burnt toast, her face a practiced mask of servant's neutrality. Yet there was a visible tension in the set of her shoulders that Clara recognized as a herald of impending chaos. Mary did not speak at first. She set the tray on the rickety bedside table with a sharp, echoing click of china against wood. The tea was pale and smelled faintly of wood smoke. Clara pushed herself up against the pillows, the movement causing a wave of nausea to roll through her stomach like a tide. She asked, her voice cracking like dry parchment, if the world had finally ended while she slept. Mary's eyes flickered toward the window. She replied that the world was very much alive and was currently gathered in a quiet, judging huddle at their front gate. There were 3 carriages from the village, and a gig bearing the Vance crest, sitting there, waiting for a glimpse of the woman who had dared to propose to the Duke of Ravenwood as a common joke. The social shaming had already begun, but it possessed a different temperature this morning. It was no longer the quiet, clinical dismissal she had mastered over the years. It was a loud, hungry curiosity that felt like teeth against her skin. Clara felt the familiar protective shape of her invisibility being stripped away, replaced by a garish and unwanted spotlight. She took a tentative sip of the cold tea, the bitterness grounding her in the harsh reality of her penury. The house around her felt smaller, more fragile, as if the weight of the village's collective gaze might finally cause the rotting timber to buckle. Mary then reached into her deep apron pocket and produced a thick rectangular envelope. The parchment was of the highest quality, creamy, heavy, and smelling faintly of cedar wood and expensive ink. The seal was the Ravenwood signet, the wax a deep, authoritative crimson that seemed to pulse with its own internal heat. Mary's hand trembled slightly as she handed the letter over. She whispered that the Duke's solicitor had arrived before the first light of dawn, delivering the summons with the kind of gravity usually reserved for the reading of a royal will. Clara stared at the crimson seal, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She was no longer a ghost inhabiting the ruins of her family name. She was a central participant in a legal drama she had accidentally authored in a moment of drunken, bitter spite. Breaking the wax felt like breaking a bone. The letter inside was not a polite refusal or a gentlemanly dismissal of a lady's temporary insanity. It was a formal communication from the office of Mr. Arthur Henderson, written in a precise, slashing hand that brooked no argument. The Duke of Ravenwood did not consider the events at Somerton Hall to be a matter of jest. He expected her attendance. He expected the joke to be treated as a contract. Clara felt the cold draft from the floorboards creeping up her spine, the exact temperature of a trap that was slowly, inevitably closing. The spiced ratafia had handed her a key, but she now realized it was the key to a cell she had built with her own hands. The smell of cold ash and damp limestone hung heavy in the Penhaligon parlor, a sensory reminder of a hearth long neglected, and a house struggling against the relentless English damp. Arthur Henderson did not look like a man who dealt in the currency of humor. He sat on the edge of a faded wingback chair, his black frock coat a stark funereal contrast to the peeling wallpaper and the upholstery that had long ago lost its brisy. However, it was the second figure in the room that truly stole the air from the space. Standing by the window, his broad back to the room, was Alistair Thorne. The Duke of Ravenwood did not move. He remained as still as gargoyle carved from the very limestone of the abbey. His presence was a heavy tectonic weight that made the small parlor feel as though it were tilting on its axis. He did not turn when Clara entered, yet she felt the exact moment his attention shifted toward her. It was a physical sensation, like the sudden arrival of a storm front. Arthur Henderson rose, with a precision that was almost surgical. He did not offer empty condolences for the state of her house or make polite remarks about the weather. He simply stated that he and His Grace were there to finalize the specific arrangements discussed at Somerton Hall. The word arrangements felt like a cold iron shackle closing around Clara's wrist. She looked toward Alistair, hoping to see some sign of the previous night's shared absurdity, but he remained a silent silhouette against the grey light. She tried to find her voice, to construct a sentence that would explain the misunderstanding, the foolish, desperate rebellion of a woman tired of being mocked. She wanted to tell them that her proposal was a phantom born of cherry liqueur and wounded pride. But Henderson was already laying out a series of heavy documents on the scarred mahogany table, the parchment rasping against the wood like dry leaves. He spoke of marriage settlements, of annuities, and of the legal perpetuity of the Ravenwood line. He produced a special license, a document of terrifying legal potency that bypassed the traditional reading of bans, and placed it atop the stack like a heavy, undeniable seal upon her fate. He moved with the rhythmic, clinical efficiency of a man who understood the bones of the thing. He knew that in the eyes of the law, a public declaration of intent was more substantial than the private intentions of the heart. Henderson informed her, without looking up from his ledger, that the Duke was not a man who engaged in public amusement. If a vow was spoken before witnesses of high standing, it was a debt to be collected with the same rigor as a mortgage or a tithe. Clara's fingers traced the rough, unfinished edge of her mended sleeve. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the Duke's wealth beginning to press down on her house. Alistair finally turned then, his searching gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Henderson said that His Grace expected her at Ravenwood Abbey by the end of the current week, he added, with a dry, rustling tone that reminded her of old library books, that her current state of penury was well understood by his office. A draft had already been deposited at the local bank in her name. a sum specifically calculated to cover her immediate expenses and the total settlement of her family's most pressing debts. It was a calculated act of rescue that felt indistinguishably like a purchase. The Duke was not just marrying her. He was foreclosing on her life. He was clearing the ledgers of the Penhaligon name, so that she would owe the remainder of her days to him alone. Clara looked down at the signature line on the primary contract, the ink already dry where Alistair Thorne had signed his name. It was a bold, aggressive hand that spoke of absolute, unwavering certainty. She realized in that moment that the Duke had truly seen her in that ballroom, not as a joke, but as a specific solution to a problem she did not yet comprehend. The exact outline of her future had just been redrawn by a man who did not care for the petty gossip of ballrooms or the shallow judgment of the Vances. She was being saved from her poverty, yes, but she was also being integrated into the heavy, silent machinery of the Ravenwood legacy. Alistair finally stepped forward, his boots echoing with a hollow thud on the floorboards. He stopped inches from her, his presence radiating a quiet, dangerous warmth. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near her own for a fraction of a second before he pulled back. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was a low rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very floor beneath them. He told her to pack only what was necessary, for Ravenwood Abbey had no need for the ghosts of her past. As the solicitor packed his leather satchel, the silence in the parlor changed its character. It was no longer the freezing, stagnant cold of social neglect. It was the heavy, electric silence of a storm that had finally broken over the house. Mr. Henderson paused at the door, his hand resting on the brass knob that Clara had spent the previous week polishing until her palms were raw. He did not look back, but his voice carried a final, chilling weight. He remarked that His Grace was a man of his word, and he expected the same of his future Duchess. He suggested that she spend the next 3 days mending whatever remained of her dignity, for the road to Ravenwood Abbey was long, and the Duke was not known for his patience with those who hesitated. When the door clicked shut behind them, the sound echoed through the empty hallway like a gavel. Clara stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors and the very real presence of a life she no longer owned. She had asked for a joke, and the universe had responded with a binding, legal reality. She looked at her calloused hands, the hands of a woman who knew how to restore cloth and balance a ruined ledger, and realized she was about to face the greatest restoration project of her life, the restoration of her own existence within the walls of a man made of shadow and stone. Let me know which part of the globe you are resting in today. Have you ever felt the profound weight of a decision made in haste that became the foundation of your future? Share your thoughts with me in the quiet sanctuary of the comments below. The carriage ride to the ruined eastern wing of Ravenwood Abbey was a long, rhythmic meditation in grey and green. A journey defined by the damp chill of the north and the steady, punishing jolts of the wheels against rain-slicked stone. Clara Penhaligon sat in the corner of the velvet-lined interior, her hands tucked into her sleeves to hide the nervous tremor that refused to subside despite her outward composure. The luxury of the carriage, the scent of well-oiled leather, and the heavy, expensive weight of the wool lap rug felt like a borrowed suit of armor that did not quite fit the contours of her soul. Outside the window, the familiar landmarks of her childhood penury faded into a landscape of jagged hills and ancient, leaning oaks that seemed to watch her passage with a dark, silent indifference. She had ceased to be a ghost of her family home, a woman defined by her social invisibility. She was now a cargo of high value, a debt being transported to its collector under the weight of a legal contract she had once thought a mere jest. When the carriage finally slowed, the sound of the wheels changed from a sharp metallic grind to a soft squelching thud against mud and rotting leaves. Clara peered out through the glass, expecting the towering spires and manicured lawns of the legendary Ravenwood Abbey. Instead, she saw the neglected periphery of the estate. It was a sprawling folly of limestone and shadow, huddled at the base of a jagged cliff like a wounded animal seeking shelter from the wind. The house was a study in profound abandonment. Ivy had long ago claimed the masonry, its thick, ropey veins prying at the mortar and prying at the very foundations of the structure. The gardens were a chaotic tangle of briars and dead thistle, and the air that greeted her when the footman opened the door was thick with the scent of wet pine, ancient soot, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of cold, stagnant water. Alistair Thorne stood on the crumbling stone steps, his greatcoat billowing around him in the sharp afternoon wind. He did not look like a bridegroom awaiting his betrothed. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield he had already decided to forfeit. His presence was the only thing in the landscape that possessed a sharp, undeniable clarity, his heavy gold ravenwood signet ring glinting dully in the pale light. He watched as Clara stepped down onto the muddy gravel, his dark gaze raking over her simple traveling cloak and the worn leather of her boots. There was no greeting of affection, no polite inquiry regarding the comfort of her journey. The silence between them was an iron wall, the exact temperature of the frost that had begun to form on the edges of the dead hydrangeas. He waited until she stood before him, her breath hitching in the cold air before he spoke. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the abbey walls. He told her, with a clinical detachment that stung worse than a physical blow, that while the Manus estate was a place of polished marble, this wing was the truth of his family, a ruin of bad debts and forgotten sorrows. He looked at the peeling lead paint on the massive front door, and then back to her flushed face, his expression unreadable. He suggested that if she truly wished to be his wife as a grand joke, she must first understand the labor required to maintain the punchline. He would not have a ballroom ornament in a house that was currently breathing dust and rot. He gave her a choice that was actually a command. She could return to her family's ruins with a generous annuity, or she could stay and prove that she possessed the structural strength necessary to support the weight of a thorn crown. Clara felt the familiar heat of indignation rising in her throat, the same fire that had been fueled by the ratafia at Somerton Hall. She looked at the house, the broken shutters, the soot-stained chimneys, and the air of heavy, suffocating neglect. She realized that Alistair was testing her, looking for the breaking point of the woman who had dared to mock him in public. But he did not know about the ledger of slights or the long nights she had spent mending cloth until her fingers bled in the dim light of her attic. He did not understand that she had been forged in the crucible of invisible labor and meticulous survival. She took a step closer to him, her boots sinking into the soft, neglected earth. She informed him, her voice steady and resonant, that she had never much cared for marble. She had always found that the most interesting truths were found in the places the world had chosen to forget. She would stay, not because of the marriage contract, but because the house was a ruin, and she was a woman who knew exactly how to mend a broken thing. The interior of the ruined wing was a cavern of stale air and shrouded furniture, a place where the sunlight struggled to penetrate the layers of grime that coated the high, narrow windows. The next morning, Clara rose before the first light had even touched the hills, the cold of the room a biting reminder of her new reality. She did not call for a maid to dress her. Instead, she reached for the sturdy linen gown she had packed in secret, the one with the reinforced seams and the deep practical pockets. She found Mary Wickham in the cavernous, soot-choked kitchen, the older woman staring in silent dismay at a hearth that looked as though it had not held a fire since the turn of the century. The smell of cold ash was overwhelming, a dry, suffocating scent that clung to the back of the throat. Mary looked at Clara's rolled-up sleeves and the determined set of her jaw, her expression a mix of servant's caution and sudden, wary respect as they faced the daunting task together. They began with the soot. It was a laborious physical struggle against years of accumulation, a task that required sand, vinegar, and a relentless, grinding effort. Clara knelt on the cold flagstones, the gritty texture of the ash staining her skin and the hem of her gown as she worked. She did not speak of her status or the Duke's challenge. She focused entirely on the physics of the restoration, the steady movement of the scrubbing brush against the stone. She learned the specific rhythm of the labor, the way the grease yields to the acidic bite of the lemon juice and the heavy, satisfying weight of the water buckets as she hauled them from the pump. This was the quiet dignity of her labor, the absolute, undeniable proof of her existence through the transformation of her environment. As the hours passed, the dark, oppressive layer of neglect began to peel away, revealing the solid oak and polished copper that lay beneath. Clara moved from the kitchen to the linen press, her calloused hands moving with a surgeon's precision as she sorted through the heavy, damp-smelling sheets. Many were ravaged by moths or the slow, creeping rot of the damp, but she saw the foundational strength of the fabric, the high-quality weave and the intricate embroidery that spoke of a former glory now hidden by dust. She sat by the small, sputtering fire she had managed to coax into the hearth, her needle flying through the fabric as she mended the tiers. She used the same meticulous technique she had used on her gala gown at Somerton, but here, in the quiet of the ruin, the work felt more honest. She was not mending a lie for a ballroom. She was mending the essential comforts of a home. The scent of lavender and cedar, which she had found in a forgotten chest, began to slowly replace the smell of rot, a sensory anchor that signaled the beginning of the house's recovery. She did not notice Alistair Thorne at first. He was a shadow among shadows, standing in the arched doorway that led to the servants' passage, his silhouette motionless against the grey light of the hallway. He had been watching her for a long time, noting the lack of complaint in her movements and the fierce, quiet focus in her eyes as she worked. He saw the callouses on her hands, not as a sign of her penury, but as the mark of a woman who understood the inherent value of manual labor. He had expected her to recoil, to demand the comforts of his title, or to weep over the state of her new prison. Instead, he found her in the dirt, restoring the heart of his house with a competence that made his own heavy silence feel like a hollow pretense. Alistair did not step forward to offer assistance, nor did he acknowledge her presence with a word. He simply stood there, an observer of a miracle he had not believed possible in such a desolate place. He realized that the joke was no longer on her. It was on the world that had dismissed her as a bankrupt ghost. He saw that she was not just invisible. She was the essential quiet force that turned a ruin into a sanctuary through sheer force of will. When she finally looked up, her face smudged with ash and her hair escaping its pins, she found his gaze. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a searching, intense curiosity that made the air between them vibrate with unspoken tension. Her long-standing reality of being entirely unnoticed had finally shifted. She was being witnessed now, not for her name or her beauty, but for the strength of her hands and the resilience of her spirit. The silence in the kitchen was thick with the scent of wet stone and soap, a quietude that was no longer a wall, but a shared space. Clara did not look away, nor did she apologize for her appearance. She stood her ground, her hand resting on the handle of the heavy copper pot she had just polished to a dull, honest glow. She told him, her voice a soft challenge in the growing twilight, that the bones of the house were still strong, but they had been lonely for a very long time. Alistair's jaw tightened, the only sign of the emotion he refused to name. He turned and left without a word, his boots echoing on the clean flagstones, but he left the door open behind him. As the fire in the hearth flickered, casting long, warm shadows across the restored room, Clara felt the first stirrings of a profound, settled peace. She was no longer a joke, and her days of isolation were finished. She was the mistress of the ruin, and the restoration had only just begun. Tell me, from what distant shore are you hearing this tale this evening? I also wonder, have you ever found that the greatest value in your life was found in a place others had dismissed as worthless? Share your stories of restoration with me in the quiet sanctuary of the comments below. The library of Ravenwood Abbey was a cathedral of neglected thought, a vast, circular chamber where the very air seemed to have solidified into a cold grey weight. It smelled of damp parchment, the sharp, acidic tang of decaying leather, and the ghost of 1,000 guttered candles. For 3 days, Clara Penhaligon had avoided this room, deterred by the heavy oak doors that seemed to hold the house's most profound secrets behind their scarred faces. Now, with a bucket of beeswax and a bundle of soft flannel cloths, she stood in the center of the dust-choked space. The silence here was not the expectant quiet of a home, it was the exact temperature of a tomb. She moved toward the massive desk that sat in the pool of weak light beneath the high, arched window, her calloused hands already reaching for the first of many neglected volumes. This was her sanctuary now. The labor of restoration was the only thing that kept the terrifying reality of her new status from crushing the breath from her lungs. She began with the lower shelves, her movements rhythmic and precise, mimicking the steady pace of her mended needlework. She wiped away the grit of decades, her flannel cloth catching on the frayed edges of ancient spines. It was as she was clearing a particularly deep recess behind a row of heavy botanical texts that her fingers brushed against something that did not feel like wood or leather. It was a metal handle, recessed and cold, hidden by the clever alignment of the shelving. She hesitated, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. An internal aside whispered that she was trespassing in the Duke's private mind. Yet, the curiosity that had sustained her through years of penury was a fierce, demanding thing. She pulled the handle, and a section of the cabinetry swung forward with a low, weighted groan, revealing a small, velvet-lined compartment filled with a series of narrow, black-bound ledgers. The ledgers were not ancient. They were modern, their covers crisp and the ink on their spines still holding a faint, chemical sheen. Clara reached for the top volume, the weight of the paper heavy and substantial in her hands. She opened it to the first page, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was a ledger of accounts, but it did not belong to Ravenwood. The name at the top of the first column, written in Alistair Thorne's aggressive, slashing hand, was Penhaligon. She turned the pages with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the meticulous rows of figures. It was a record of debts, every mortgage, every unpaid merchant's bill, and every sagging annuity that had been dragging her family into the dirt for the last decade. But these were not merely records of what was owed. Each entry was marked with a date and a crimson seal that indicated the debt had been purchased and retired. The dates were the most devastating part of the discovery. The first of her family's major debts had been bought by the Duke of Ravenwood nearly 3 years ago. The most recent, the mortgage on her childhood home, had been settled 6 months before the Somerton Ball. This was not a sudden act of charity born of a drunken proposal. It was a long, calculated campaign of restoration. Alistair had been quietly rebuilding the foundation of her life from the shadows long before she had ever dared to speak his name in that ballroom. He had been watching her struggle, witnessing the crushing totality of her isolation, and he had chosen to act without ever demanding the currency of her gratitude. Clara felt a sudden, sharp ache in her throat, a mixture of profound relief and a new, terrifying vulnerability. She was not a joke he had accepted on a whim. She was a project he had been mending in secret for years. She replaced the ledger with the care one might afford a holy relic, her mind reeling with the implications of the Duke's silence. Why had he allowed her to believe the marriage was a penalty? Why had he let her work in the soot of the kitchens when he had already paid for her freedom? She sat on the edge of the heavy desk, the smell of the beeswax now mingling with the scent of old library leather, and realized that Alistair Thorne did not know how to speak of love or protection. He only knew how to speak of ledgers and stone. He was a man who mended the bones of things because he did not trust the skin to hold. She looked out at the rolling grey hills of the estate, her vision blurred by a sudden stinging heat in her eyes. He had seen her when she was a ghost, and he had decided in his own silent, tectonic way that she was worth saving. The sound of a carriage on the gravel driveway shattered the library's heavy quiet, a sharp, metallic intrusion that signaled the arrival of the outside world. Clara stood, smoothing the reinforced linen of her gown and wiping the grey smudge of dust from her cheek. She moved to the window and saw a familiar emerald gig perched before the steps of the ruined wing. Lady Honoria Vance stepped down from the vehicle, her movements characterized by the predatory grace of a woman who had come to witness a defeat. Draped in fine sarsenet and carrying a silk parasol as if it were a weapon, Honoria looked like a vibrant poisonous flower dropped into a field of grey stones. Clara felt the familiar coldness of social judgment begin to seep through the walls of the abbey, the exact temperature of the malice she had navigated since childhood. She met Honoria in the draughty entrance hall, the scent of the visitor's expensive French perfume clashing violently with the smell of the vinegar and wood smoke that clung to Clara's own clothes. Honoria did not wait for a formal greeting. She began her dissection with a sharp, raking gaze that took in Clara's rolled sleeves and the callous texture of her hands. She remarked, her voice a needle of polished ice, that it was truly a tragedy to see a Penhaligon reduced to the labor of a common scullery maid. She added with a calibrated sigh of mock pity that perhaps the Duke had intended the marriage to be a form of domestic service rather than a union of peers. The social shaming was a calculated insult, a jagged piece of glass wrapped in elegant velvet, designed to remind Clara that no amount of legal contracts could change the reality of her penury. Clara did not flinch. She felt the heavy weight of the black ledgers in the library behind her, the concrete evidence of a protection that Honoria could never hope to understand. She replied, her voice carrying the steady, rhythmic resonance of a woman who had found her center, that she found the labor of restoration to be far more honest than the labor of flattery. She informed her visitor that the bones of the house were strong, and she took a particular satisfaction in mending things that the world had chosen to throw away. The silence that followed was thick and stagnant, the tension in the hallway a physical pressure against the chest. Honoria's mouth thinned into a hard, bitter line, her eyes flashing with the realization that her weapons of mockery were no longer finding their mark. It was then that Alistair Thorne entered the hall. He did not arrive with a flourish. He simply appeared, a massive silhouette of shadow and granite that seemed to absorb the light from the open doorway. He moved with the quiet economy of power that had always defined him, his heavy gold signet ring glinting dully as he removed his gloves. He did not look at Honoria at first. His gaze went directly to Clara, noting the smudges of soot on her apron and the defiant light in her eyes. He stepped closer to her, his presence a sheltering stone mountain that made the drafty hallway feel suddenly warm. When he finally turned to Lady Honoria, his expression was a study in profound clinical indifference, a look that was far more devastating than any shouted anger. He spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very flagstones beneath their feet. He remarked with a dry, rustling tone that he was surprised to find a Vance at the ruined wing, given their well-known aversion to anything that was not covered in a fresh layer of gilding. He then took Clara's hand, his large palm warm and firm against her calloused fingers. He brought her hand up, turning it so that the evidence of her labor was visible in the grey light. He stated, his eyes locked onto Honoria's ashen face, that he found more nobility in the dirt-stained hands of his wife than he had ever found in the entire history of the Vance family. He added that Clara was not a servant in his house. She was the foundation of it. Honoria Vance recoiled as if she had been struck, her emerald silk rustling like the skin of a dying snake. The Duke did not wait for a response. He informed the visitor that the road back to Somerton was long and the weather was turning cold, and he would hate for her delicate sensibilities to be further offended by the sight of honest work. It was a dismissal of such absolute finality that it left no room for the usual social games. As Honoria retreated to her gig, her face a mask of pale fury and humiliated shock, Clara felt a profound, settling peace. The poetic justice of the moment was not found in the Duke's wealth or his title, but in the fact that he had seen her labor and found it priceless. He had stopped the music of the world to defend the woman who had endured decades of being unseen. When the gig had vanished into the grey mist of the driveway, Alistair did not immediately let go of Clara's hand. He stood with her in the silence of the entrance hall, the smell of the damp earth and the fading perfume of his visitor still hanging in the air. He did not apologize for his intervention, nor did he offer words of comfort. He simply looked at the clean flagstones she had spent the morning scrubbing, and then back to her. He remarked, his voice a soft rasp that held a new subterranean warmth, that the library would likely take her a fortnight to finish. Clara smiled, a sharp, feral expression that had nothing to do with ballrooms and everything to do with survival. She told him that she would likely have it done in a week. As they stood together in the ruins of the abbey, the restoration of their world felt no longer like a sentence, but like a vow. Please share what city or countryside you call home tonight. Did you ever feel the fierce, quiet triumph of having your worth recognized by someone who values the truth over the mask? Share your stories of sanctuary with me in the quiet library of the comments below. The scent of linseed oil and the lingering heat of the hearth anchored the small kitchen as the meal began. It was a quiet affair of roasted fowl and winter root vegetables, served upon the very oak table Clara Penhaligon had scrubbed until the grain wept with cleanliness. The kitchen, once a cavern of soot and stagnant shadows, now breathed with the warm amber light of the fire. There was a profound, humming stillness in the air, the kind of quiet that only exists in a space where the walls have been mended by hand and the floorboards found to have finally ceased their rhythmic groaning. Alistair Thorne sat across from her, his massive frame seemingly at odds with the humble domesticity of the space. Yet his presence no longer felt like a cold intrusion. He watched her as she ate, his dark gaze tracing the precise, economical movements of her hands. Clara Penhaligon felt the heavy weight of the secret she had found in the library, the black-bound ledgers that acted as a silent, ink-stained map of her own survival. She set her fork down with a soft, metallic clink against the china, the sound echoing in the intimate space like a summons. She began by mentioning the black-bound ledgers, her voice steady despite the flutter of her pulse. She did not ask for a formal explanation, for she knew that Alistair Thorne was a man who preferred the evidence of action over the fragility of a spoken promise. She simply stated that she had seen the records of her family's retired debts. The silence that followed was thick with the scent of rosemary, baked bread, and wood smoke. The Duke did not look away, nor did he offer a defensive posture. He told her, his voice a low rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very stones beneath them, that he had spent years watching the Penhaligon legacy crumble into the North Sea. He remarked that he had noted how she had carried the weight of it on her narrow shoulders, mending her own gowns by candlelight and balancing accounts that were already written in the red. To offer her charity during those years would have been a calculated insult to her integrity, a way of making her invisible in a different, more crushing way. Alistair Thorne explained that he had been searching for a bridge, a moment where he could intervene without shattering the foundational pride that defined her. He had been purchasing her family's ruins from the shadows, waiting for the day when he could return them to her as a fortress rather than a cage. When she had stood in the ballroom at Somerton Hall, flushed with the reckless irony of the spiced ratafia, and asked him to marry her as a grand joke, he had seen the opening he required. He whispered that his one-word response, "done," had not been a surrender to a prank. It had been the final seal upon a contract he had been drafting in his mind for half a decade. He had accepted the joke because it provided the only social mask heavy enough to cover his true intentions. He did not want a victim to rescue. He wanted a partner who understood the exact cost of restoration. The following morning, the peace of the ruined eastern wing was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clatters of a carriage and the imperious chime of the door pull. Clara was in the midst of finishing the library, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hands stained with the dust of old parchment and the grey residue of soot. Lady Honoria Vance did not wait for Mary Wickham to announce her. She swept into the room like a cold draught, her silk pelisse rustling with an agitated metallic sound. She stopped short, her gaze raking over Clara's dishevelled state with a look of profound, calculated disgust. She remarked, her voice dripping with the social coldness of her station, that she had heard rumours of the Duke's madness, but she had not realised he had turned a Penhaligon into a common scullery maid. She laughed, a brittle sound that lacked any true mirth, and told Clara that her joke of a marriage had clearly backfired, leaving her to rot in the very dust she had come from. Before Clara could find the words to defend the dignity of her labour, the shadow of Alistair Thorne filled the doorway. He did not shout. His power was expressed through a terrifying absolute stillness. He stepped into the room, his gaze moving from Clara's soot-stained, calloused hands to Lady Honoria's pale, gloved ones. He told Honoria, his voice a subterranean rumble that brooked no argument, that she was mistaken. He remarked that Clara's hands were the most noble things in the county, for they were the hands of a builder, a restorer, and a woman who possessed the courage to mend what others would only mock. He looked Honoria directly in the eye and stated that her own hands were soft only because they had never held the weight of a single honest thing in her entire life. With a precise, icy formality, he informed Lady Honoria that her presence was no longer required at Ravenwood Abbey, nor would it be welcome at any future gathering he hosted. The dismissal was absolute. Lady Honoria, stunned into a rare and frantic silence by the Duke's directness, gathered her skirts and retreated from the room, the sound of her departure echoing through the hallway like the fading of a spent storm. Alistair did not immediately turn to Clara. He looked instead at the shelves she had organized and the ledgers she had mended. He told her, his voice softening into that new, warm rasp, that she had nothing to fear from the whispers of those who only understood the surface of things. He remarked that they were both menders of broken things, two souls who found more beauty in the bones of a ruin than in the gilding of a ballroom. As the fire in the library hearth crackled, sending a spray of sparks into the chimney, the air between them shifted. The tension was no longer born of uncertainty, but of a shared recognition. The labor was no longer a domestic necessity. It was a quiet, solemn communion. The scent of lavender and the crisp bite of starch filled the bedchamber a week later as Clara Penhaligon stood before the looking-glass. The upcoming gala at Somerton Hall was a looming, crystalline storm on the horizon, a grand theatrical event designed to formalize a union that the county still considered a scandalous mystery. Mary Wickham moved behind her with practiced, quiet efficiency, her hands arranging the heavy cascading folds of a new gown made of deep midnight blue silk. The fabric felt like cool water against Clara's skin, a luxurious and terrifying contrast to the reinforced linen she had worn for the grueling weeks of restoration. As she looked at her reflection, she saw that the woman in the glass was no longer the ghost who had mended her own sarsenet by the light of a single tallow candle. Her face held a new tempered strength, a quiet resilience that had been forged in the soot of the kitchens and the silence of the library. Her calloused hands remained the hands of a restorer, a physical ledger of the work she had done to reclaim her life. Alistair Thorne entered the room as the candles, were burning low, his silhouette a daunting, impenetrable presence in the doorway. He was dressed for the evening in a frock coat of charcoal wool, his dark cravat tied with the same surgical precision he applied to his estate ledgers. He carried a small, velvet-lined box of dark, aged wood, the ravenwood signet on his finger catching the flickering light. He approached her without a word, his presence radiating a quiet, dangerous warmth that made the draughty chamber feel suddenly anchored. He opened the box to reveal a necklace of heavy, hand-wrought gold, anchored by a single deep-sea sapphire that seemed to hold a light of its own. He told her, his voice a subterranean rumble, that it was a Thorn heirloom, a piece given only to the women who served as the cornerstone of the house. It was not a trinket of beauty, but a symbol of structural necessity. As he fastened the weight of history around her neck, the metal felt cold and substantial against her collarbone. The sapphire rested exactly at the hollow of her throat, a heavy blue eye that seemed to witness the truth of her transformation. Alistair Thorne did not pull away once the clasp was secured. He rested his large hands on her shoulders, his gaze meeting hers in the reflection of the glass. He told her that tonight, the society of the North would not see a joke or a bankrupt daughter of a ruined house. They would see the Duchess of Ravenwood, the only woman in the world who possessed the mind and the hands strong enough to mend the bones of a thorn. He whispered that she should not fear their whispers, for the loudest truths are often those written in the quietest ledgers. The necklace was not just a gift. It was a suit of armor forged from the legacy of those who had weathered the storm before her. Clara Penhaligon touched the cold stone of the sapphire, her fingers tracing the intricate gold filigree. She realized that she had ceased to be nervous about the judgment of Lady Honoria Vance or the mocking laughter of the local gentry. She had devoted so many years to mastering the brutal art of invisibility, but tonight she would stand in the ordinary light, fully witnessed and entirely herself. The transition from the ruined wing to the Grand Assembly was not a jump between two worlds. It was a continuation of the same restoration. She was the architect of her own vindication, and the Duke was her witness. As they turned to leave the room, the heavy blue silk of her gown rustling like the wind through the Abbey's ancient oaks, she felt a profound sense of safety. The door to her past was closing with a soft final click, and the road to the gathering was no longer a path of shame, but a march of triumph. The carriage waited in the drive, its lamps casting long yellow fingers of light into the evening mist. Alistair Thorne handed her inside with a gentleness that was at odds with his formidable size, his hand a steadying force against the damp chill of the night. As the wheels began their rhythmic grind against the gravel, Clara Penhaligon looked back at the ruined eastern wing. It was no longer a place of abandonment. It was a sanctuary of light and mended stone. The house was breathing again, and so was she. The formal gala at Somerton Hall would be the final test of their joke, the moment where the phantom proposal would be revealed as the most solid reality of their lives. She leaned back into the velvet cushions, the weight of the heirloom necklace a comforting pressure against her chest. She had asked for a joke to save her from the boredom of being invisible, and she had found a man who had been watching her in the shadows all along, waiting for the moment he could finally see her. I wonder where on this earth you find yourself right now. Has there ever been a time you had to find the courage to step out of the shadows of your own past to claim the worth you have always possessed? Share your stories of sanctuary and restoration with me in the quiet library of the comments below. The grand ballroom at Somerton Hall was exactly as she remembered it, yet entirely transformed by the new, heavy gravity of her own presence. It smelled of the same expensive beeswax candles and cloying floral perfumes, but the metallic tang of social judgment had lost its ability to chill her blood. Clara Penhaligon stood at the entrance, her hand resting upon the sleeve of Alistair Thorne's charcoal wool frock coat, feeling the solid heat of his arm beneath the fabric. The silence that greeted them was not the dismissive quiet she had navigated for a lifetime. It was a breathless, arrested vacuum. The quartet's music seemed to falter for a fraction of a second, as the candlelight caught the deep-sea sapphire at her throat. The midnight blue silk of her gown rustled with a rhythmic, confident sound, a sharp contrast to the desperate straining of the mended sarsenet she had worn only weeks before. She felt the weight of the Thorn heirloom necklace, a heavy gold anchor that confirmed her place as the cornerstone of a legacy she had helped to restore with her own hands. Lady Honoria Vance approached them with the same predatory grace as before, but the emerald of her gown now seemed garish and desperate against the stark elegance of Alistair's wife. Honoria did not offer a curtsy of genuine respect. Her movement was a jagged, performed thing that carried the temperature of a brewing storm. She stopped just short of their personal space, her sharp gaze raking over the sapphire and the unmistakable texture of Clara's calloused hands, which were now partially veiled by fine lace. Honoria spoke, her voice carrying that polished, needle-like edge, designed to cut through the surrounding silence. She remarked, loud enough for the inner circle of the ton to hear, that it was truly a testament to the Duke's sense of humor that he had allowed a drunken prank to proceed this far. She added, with a calculated, shimmering smile, that everyone remembered the spiced ratafia and the desperate laughter of a bankrupt daughter. To Honoria, the marriage was still a phantom, a social fever dream that she intended to break with the cold reality of a public reminder. Clara felt the familiar prickle of heat in her throat, but it was no longer the dry burn of suppressed grief. She looked directly at Honoria, her gaze steady and searching, refusing to play the game of averted eyes and soft apologies. She admitted, her voice carrying a bell-like clarity that seemed to still the very air of the ballroom, that the proposal had indeed begun in a moment of reckless ironies. She acknowledged the ratafia and the bitterness that had fueled her uncharacteristic bravery in this very room. However, Clara informed the gathered gentry that while the joke had been her creation, the restoration that followed was the only truth that mattered. She spoke of the soot she had scrubbed and the ledgers she had balanced, her words acting as a clinical observation of the labor Honoria would never understand. Clara Penhaligon stated that she had spent a lifetime learning the brutal art of erasing her own existence, but she had discovered that the most solid things in the world are often found in the places others choose to ignore. Alistair Thorne did not move to interrupt her. He allowed her to stand her ground, his stillness a profound testament to his respect for her competence. He stood beside Clara like a limestone fortress, his dark gaze never wavering from Honoria's ashen face. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to directly vibrate in the floorboards beneath their feet. He told the room that he was a man who valued the bones of things, the structural integrity of a house, and the unwavering character of a woman. Alistair remarked that he had been watching Clara Penhaligon long before the Somerton Ball, witnessing the quiet, fierce resilience she had used to hold her family's ruins together. He informed the guests that he had not accepted a joke. He had accepted a partner who was capable of mending the very soul of Ravenwood Abbey. His power was expressed not through a raised voice, but through the terrifying absolute certainty of his regard. Lady Honoria attempted one final desperate parry, her voice trembling with the realization that her social weapons were shattering against the Duke's resolve. She asked, her words a frantic rustle of silk, how a union born of such undignified circumstances could ever be recognized by the law or the crown. It was at this precise moment that Mr. Arthur Henderson stepped out from the shadows of the arched doorway, his black frock coat and leather satchel a stark reminder of the legal machinery that anchored the Thorne estate. He did not offer a greeting. He simply produced a thick, rectangular parchment from his bag. The document was heavy with the weight of official seals and the unmistakable, authoritative crimson wax of the Duke's signet. Mr. Henderson stated, his voice a dry, rustling sound like old library books, that the marriage had been formalized under a special license and witnessed by the highest authorities. He added that the Penhaligon debts had been retired in perpetuity, and the union was a legal reality that stood beyond the reach of ballroom gossip. Alistair took the parchment from the solicitor, his movements characterized by the same surgical precision he applied to every aspect of his life. He held it up briefly, the candlelight illuminating the bold, aggressive signatures that sealed the contract. He then turned back to Clara Penhaligon, his expression softening into a look of such intense, protective tenderness that a collective gasp rippled through the room. He reminded the assembly of the single word he had whispered in response to her proposal. Done, Alistair whispered it again now, but it was no longer the closing of an iron door. It was the opening of a future. Everyone froze as the weight of that word finally settled over the ballroom, transforming the drunken joke into the most solid, undeniable vow of the season. The social shaming that had defined Clara's life for a decade dissolved in that moment, replaced by the profound settling peace of total vindication. The poetic justice of the evening was not found in the public humiliation of Lady Honoria Vance, though the woman's quick retreat from the floor was witnessed by all. It was found in the way the gentry began to shift their own positions. their formerly cold dismissals replaced by a frantic desire to be recognized by Clara. Now officially acknowledged as the Duchess, Clara watched them with a quiet, detached irony. Her mind, returning to the damp stones of the abbey and the scent of the wood smoke in the restored kitchen. She realized that these people were the guests now, their lives defined by the hollow performance of status, while she and Alistair were built of something more substantial. She had mended her own life just as she had mended the linens and the ledgers, and the cornerstone she had become was now the foundation upon which the county would rest. As the quartet resumed its music, a soft, rhythmic waltz that seemed to mimic the steady beat of a heart in a quiet house, Alistair led her toward the center of the floor. He did not ask her to dance. He simply waited for her to step into the space he provided. His large hand was warm and firm against her waist, a sensory anchor that signaled her absolute safety. They moved together with a harmony that had nothing to do with social training and everything to do with the shared silence of their labors at the abbey. Clara leaned her head slightly toward his shoulder, the scent of cedar wood and old library leather a comforting sanctuary. She had spent a lifetime learning the cold geometry of being ignored in this very room. Now she stood in the ordinary light, fully witnessed entirely herself, and finally profoundly seen. The gala continued around them, a blur of spinning silk and flickering candles, but the world had narrowed to the small, intimate space between the Duke and his wife. The transition from the ruined wing to this grand ballroom was complete, and the restoration of the Penhaligon name was no longer a project, but a finished masterpiece. As they stepped out onto the balcony later that evening, the cold north wind carrying the scent of salt and ancient pines, Clara looked out at the dark hills. The house at Ravenwood Abbey was breathing again, its bones strong and its fires lit. She felt the heavy sapphire at her throat, a physical reminder that she was the architect of her own salvation. The loudest truths were indeed found in the quietest ledgers, and the joke that had started it all had become the most beautiful reality she had ever dared to imagine. Tell me, from which corner of the world are you listening this evening? And have you ever found the courage to claim your worth in a world that tried to make you invisible? Have you ever felt the peace of finding a sanctuary built by your own hands? Share your stories of restoration and triumph with me in the quiet library of the comments below. Justice is not always a gavel. Sometimes it is the sound of a key turning in a lock that was always yours. Listen for the water, not the wheel tonight. And remember that the most beautiful things are often those we choose to mend ourselves. Thank you for spending the Blue Hour with me. Until our next ledger is opened, sleep in the safety of a home you have built, and know that you are at last seen.